to the survey, Nic, this is your book, right? Yeah. And I have some questions.
Election, yeah.
You think Museveni has a copy of your book?
I don't think Museveni needs it. I think Museveni could have written it.
Yeah, exactly. And you also provide a couple of examples of the things that were done in Uganda, but also in Zambia. Now, I don't know if you or Brian Klaas wrote that part, but I saw this interesting anecdote that you gave about the elections like 10 years ago, and the opposition party did have the votes, but they didn't have the money against the government, and the government, just like the Ugandan government, was just giving out money in turn for their votes. And then the opposition came up with the phrase "Don't kubeba," which means just give me the money, but don't tell them that you're actually going to vote with your heart and not with your wallet.
That's mine.
Right?
Yeah, I was at that election. So that was the then running mates for Michael Sarter, Guy Scott, who had English and Bemba, but not enough Bemba, I think, to complete the full statement. So he merged English and Bemba, don't kabeba, an English word and a Bemba word. And yeah, meaning, you can take their money, but don't tell them that you're going to vote for us anyway. And I think we've seen this in a number of countries, right, where opposition leaders have said, look, you can take money from wherever you want. You can take food from wherever you want. You can take, other inducements from wherever you want. But we do have a secret ballot, and you can go into the polling booth and you can vote for whoever you want, and they can't tell. So, take all the money that the ruling party is giving you, but vote for us. And in Zambia, that proved to be very effective. And we've seen a number of countries.
Nic, we don't hear you. Yeah. But while we don't hear Nic, one of the things that Nic is also describing in his book, various techniques where you
vote buying is actually ultimately proved to be fairly ineffective. And
all right, Nico, go ahead.
Yeah. Let's just give it a couple of seconds.
Yes.
So we're in a total blackout here. Everything has gone. The lights have gone. The electricity has gone. It's not just a bad line. So what I was saying was that we've seen that in a number of elections, and I think it's partly because people often, and actually it's much more sophisticated. And voters often don't simply want to sell their vote. They want to vote for somebody that they believe is credible.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. What's interesting in your book, Nic, is that you're saying ballot box stuffing is basically the last resort of a president. It's not the best strategy. And in the survey that we are going to be discussing later, it shows that actually Museveni is lagging Chigalanji a lot at this moment. So the question is, at some stage you come to a point, how many ballots do you have to stuff into that ballot box to win? And at some stage there are not just enough ballots available anymore. Did you hear that, Nic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that is often true is that leaders win when they basically lose. They rig when they lose by a relatively small margin. If you lose by a really big margin, it can actually be very difficult to rig the election. And in Zambia, Michael Sarter basically beat Rupaya Banda by so many votes that there were not enough votes in the country. There were not enough ballot papers in the country to fill in to get the president over the line. I think in Nigeria, probably in 2015, it was a bit the same. I mean, Goodluck Jonathan lost by so many votes that, actually there probably were not enough ballot papers in the country to be able to get him over the line. So I think those things, do make a difference. And I always say to my friends in opposition parties across the continent, if you really want to win, you probably need to win by 5%. If you win by 1% or 2%, it's too easy to manipulate the vote to get the president over the line. It's when you win by over 5% that you can probably win, because that's so big that it becomes really difficult for the president to actually manipulate the votes to make it look like they were successful, unless the president is going to completely give up on credibility and legitimacy. And of course, that's what we saw in Tanzania, right? What was really striking, and I think for many of us really worrying in Tanzania, was that the government gave up on credibility and legitimacy. They basically said, we're not even going to try and make it look democratic. We're not even going to do the things we used to do to make it look legitimate. We're actually just going to arrest everybody and make the results up. And that's a really scary moment, because that's the moment when actually the government almost, moves to a point where anything becomes conceivable. And, it'd be really interesting to see. We could be, as you said earlier, in that moment in Uganda where President Museveni completely gives up and simply fabricates everything and moves to arrest the entirety of the Bobi Wine infrastructure. It could be where we go. As soon as you move in that direction, of course, then all bets are off. Because the president no longer cares about making it look respectable. But to go back to some of the examples in the book from Uganda, I mean, we talk about the last election, 2016. There's a number of areas in 2016 where President Museveni wins 100% of the vote on 100% turnout. Now we know that that's not possible, right? It's not possible that every single person was available to vote. Somebody would have died. Somebody would have been sick. It's also not possible that every single person actually, even if they wanted to vote for Museveni, someone would have made an error. It's not possible that every single person voted for him. So we know that there are lots of areas. Now, this isn't officially an electoral offence. It's an electoral offence to have 101% turnout and 101% of people vote for President Museveni. So, officially, he's within the rules. But it's not plausible, right? It's not logically plausible that he could win 100% of the vote and 100% turnout in so many parts of the country in his home areas. So again, I think there's this really interesting question that, all the way through when Museveni's rigging elections, he's trying to rig it in a way that's officially legal. There's nothing illegal about getting 100% of the vote and 100% turnout. It's just implausible. It's not possible. We know that it's not true. So will he have to go even beyond that to win this election? And again, then you lose the legitimacy. Everybody can see. It's like the emperor's new clothes. Everybody knows that this was a clearly rigged and manipulated election. But to go back to what we were saying earlier, maybe we're now in a moment in Africa where leaders feel that they can be that brazen, that they can actually be that blatant. Yes. Because, whatever we think about Biden, even if you think that Joe Biden will be a better leader of America and will engage more constructively with Africa, he's not going to be president of America for another 60 days. And the UK is completely consumed with Brexit and the coronavirus crisis. Most of Europe and the United Nations is not actually operating effectively to promote democracy around the world right now. So maybe this is a particular international kind of constellation of factors that is, leading to a lack of promotion of democracy that actually, will embolden somebody like Museveni to do that. And I think that's one of the big risks, I think, and fears for me moving forwards.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you also discuss gerrymandering a lot. Now, maybe some of our viewers don't know what that word means. So gerrymandering is where you adjust the voting districts in such a way that you just get over the majority so that you have the seat. Now, for a presidential election, the form of the district doesn't matter that much, but it seems because Museveni has also added many districts and changed many districts, but it looks like it's not so much done to have the majority of the votes there, but to be able to obscure the process, enable to rig elections. Do you also see it in that way?
Yes, I do. But I'd also add a second thing. I mean, in many countries in Africa, we see presidents creating new units or districts ahead of elections. And it's often because these are basically seen as ways of buying people off. They create opportunities and jobs. They're often ways of giving people, different parts of the country a bit more recognition. So they're often, in a sense, a kind of patronage offer or a clientelistic offer to try and bring different parts of the country into the system. I remember, I think President Kibaki in Kenya managed to create something like 200 additional districts before one election. And as much as it was about, trying to obscure things, it was about basically trying to make promises to those parts of the country that, look, if you vote for us, we'll create these new districts which will be responsible for you, and you'll potentially get greater access to state resources. So I think it's also a kind of a sort of vote buying type strategy as well. Again, I think a big question is, how much do people buy it? Do they say, well, we've had these promises before, every election, President Museveni comes around and tells us that the economy will do better, there'll be more jobs, he'll create these new units, and actually after the election, a lot of this stuff doesn't materialize, so we no longer believe it? Or, is there a way in which he can persuade people that this is true and that this means that he's a good person to vote for? And of course, he's been relatively clever in that he's identified that he needs to try and appeal to the youth. He's identified that he needs to kind of make new and additional promises. I think the question I have is whether, Ugandans, having seen Museveni in power for quite so long, really believe any of those promises anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe this is a good point to ask our colleague Maria if there are any questions from the audience, because Nick, we're also broadcasting on El Kyoto, and there are many comments coming in. And Maria, can you tell us, are there any questions for Nick?
There is no any question specifically for Nick, but most of the questions that comes in actually the hashtags. But one question goes, how do we go beyond discussions on this platform? That is James William Mogeni. So he's asking, how do we go beyond just having discussions on platforms and have something tangible?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Go, Nico. What were you going to say?
No, I want to give you the word.
No, I think it's a really great question, and we actually discussed this recently on our show, The Resistance Bureau. That if you look at Zimbabwe, for example, Zimbabwe Lives Matter as a hashtag trended around the world, had international traction. It was trending in the US, it was trending in the UK, it trended in South Africa. It was seen to be successful. There were lots of discussions online, and yet Mugabe is still in power, ZANU-PF is still in power, and some of the people who we were at the time protesting about being free, like the journalist were then arrested and denied bail. So, what good did our international sort of movement, what good did our Twitter, what good did our social media presence actually do if actually on the ground the president's still in power and journalists that are revealing corruption is still.
I think he will come.
Yes.
Maybe Maria, you can. There were other interesting comments.
Go on.
So I think I got cut off there, but I was just saying that, so I think the key is, does this social media presence and discussion get connected to something real in the country concerned? And I think that means at a certain point, you have to ask questions like, are trade unions or urban workers on the side of a certain candidate going to be willing to strike? Can you bring the country to an economic standstill in order to protest the lack of democracy? Can you actually bring religious groups and organizations, which often sit on the fence because they don't want to offend the government? Can you bring them into the conversation and actually have letters from pastors and church leaders saying this is not acceptable, the abuse of human rights is not acceptable? And if you can start to build from the online conversation to civil society groups, religious groups, trade union groups, urban mobilization, Bobby Wine support base, all of a sudden you can start to create a coalition that cuts across urban, rural areas, potentially even cuts across party lines of people who are saying they want to see democracy and they want to see a free and fair election. And that's when, for example, in places like Malawi, you really start to feel that the government is being forced back. And the government is almost forced to allow a better quality election because of the strength of that coalition against it. But it's extremely difficult to do. I mean, I was on a call yesterday with Fatma Karume talking about Tanzania, and I made a similar point, and she said, it's all well and good for you sitting in Malawi saying this as an academic, but the people on the ground who are the civil society activists are going to have to risk their lives to go on those protests. They're going to have to risk their jobs to, go on strike. They're going to have to risk angering the president to write those statements, and religious leaders might risk their churches being shut down or targeted if they actually come out and say something that's critical of the ruling party. And I think that's true. I mean, one of the terrifying things that we've seen in recent days in Uganda and also in Tanzania is that arbitrary use of force. We see people who are actually being shot dead. In Uganda, I don't know if you can confirm this, Nico and Patricia, but I was also receiving reports not just of violence, but also of people who are outside of military uniform or police uniform using guns, shooting at protesters, shooting above the heads of protesters. So moving to a point where actually it's not just official uniform personnel, but it's actually people who are out of uniform who are doing this. And that kind of suggests, a fundamental breakdown of the rule of law as well. So I think, it's one thing to say this is how you would translate digital action into real world action and therefore put the pressure back on the president. But it's a very different thing to actually realize that given the risks that people would have to face.
Yeah, I think I can confirm that indeed there were people shooting on the street with just civilian clothes, and clearly they were accepted to be there by the military. So yes, we are unfortunately making that step.
And I think that's a really worrying step, right? That's a really dangerous, worrying step. It's a step towards something that we've seen in other countries when you then get people in plain clothes conducting things like abductions. And in places like Zimbabwe, when people are actually go missing and the police then deny knowledge of them going missing, partly because it seems that they've been taken by perhaps people in plain clothes as a way of denying that the state actually was involved in this. And so I think that move from officials to people in uniform to people outside of uniform is really important. And some people have said to me over the last few days, why does this matter? As long as people are shooting at protesters, it's all the same thing. But I think actually as soon as you start to see people out of uniform, that's suggesting to you that this is a deliberate attempt by the state to harm
and Patricia, I think this is probably a good point to discuss our survey that we've done.